Hello and welcome to Craftwork, a podcast by writers for writers.
Craftwork is recorded in Fredericton, New Brunswick, on the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Wolastoqiyik, the people of the Wolastoq River. I'm Miriam Riche.
And I'm Mike Thorne, we'll be your co-hosts. The music for this podcast is composed and recorded by Randy Nickel-Schroeder.
Naben Ruthnum is a Toronto-based writer of fiction, cultural criticism, film, and TV. His novel, A Hero of Our Time, was released by Penguin Random House and was optioned for development by the Littlefield Company. His books include the YA novel The Grimmer, the World Fantasy Award-nominated horror novella Helpmeet, and two thrillers penned as Nathan Ripley, both of which have been optioned for development and were published internationally. He has written for Canadian television series, including Murdoch Mysteries and Cardinal. As a feature screenwriter, he's collaborated with Kris Bertin for feature and TV projects in development at Oddfellows, BoulderLight Pictures, Automatik, Skybound, and Blink 49. Kris and Naben's script, Road Test, made the 2024 Blacklist.
Hey, Naben.
How's it going?
Doing well. How are you?
Good.
Thanks so much for joining us, for coming on our podcast. Naben, what were the books that first got you excited about reading and writing? What were some of your earliest quote-unquote literary loves?
Something that comes to mind is The Collector by John Fowles, who's also more famous for The Magus. There's sort of like a turn halfway through that book where a different character starts narrating the book, and that really impressed me at the age I read it, which I think was about 13. In addition to being like a really immersive novel about a disturbed mind, and it ended up having a lot to do with stuff that I'd write too, both as a thriller writer and a literary fiction writer. Yeah, and going earlier than that even, I read a lot of grown-up books young because my parents wouldn't let me watch the movies of them, essentially. So like Clockwork Orange, for example, was, you read it for salacious reasons because you hear it's violent and crazy, but Anthony Burgess is so brilliant with language that you end up learning something by accident. Ian Fleming's James Bond books were also early influences for me, not on anything I ended up writing, but it just sort of opened the world of what I found interesting and exciting, aside from the children's books that I also liked by John Bellairs, etc.
We both love The Collector. I think that's fair to say, right, Miriam?
Oh, cool.
Absolutely. I grew up I had these like BBC's Shakespeare animated tapes, and The Tempest was my favorite, and there were a lot of like Tempest references in The Collector, which kind of excited me. Also just like the two different, just doing the same thing over again through two POVs.
Yeah.
Mike and I talk about that a lot and like want to use that kind of device, but still looking for a place to put it.
The Collector brought to mind, I really enjoyed your novella Helpmeet. And as someone who often writes horror fiction, I'm also curious to hear what some of the most formative horror novels or stories for you were, if there are some all-time favorites or writers who left a particularly indelible print. Like I definitely see the Henry James and the Melville novellas in that, but I'm curious if there are some like capital H horror people in there too.
Yeah, for sure. Early on at a library book sale, I got the anthology The Sorceress in Stained Glass, which is by the UK anthologist Richard Dalby. At that time, he was doing sort of what I believe Johnny Maines does now, trawling through like old periodicals for lesser known works by often late 19th century, very early 20th century ghost story writers. M.R. James and E.F. Benson were big for me. Also a slightly later writer, Wakefield. I think it's H.R. Wakefield. But then also, a lot of normal stuff that you expect. Like obviously there's quite a bit of Lovecraft as well in Helpmeet. That I just got into through the old Del Rey best of. And also I shouldn't neglect to say that films are a big influence too for that. So The Fly and horror cinema were big for me too. But I think if there's like a little interesting pocket niche, it's that I really do like those sort of UK fin de siècle, English in particular and Irish ghost stories.
You did a master's thesis regarding Oscar Wilde's ghost stories, or Oscar Wilde's influence on the ghost story. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm not a great scholar or even a good one, but I had the idea that Oscar Wilde's trials being so enormously popular and having such an impact on the aesthete decadent movements in the UK, they forced a lot of men who had previously, been able to occupy a place in society that wasn't certainly like out of the closet, but wasn't quite what we term closeted now. Like a lot of the flamboyant, so to speak, behaviors that one associates with Wilde and just sort of the green carnation, purple suited, just sort of wonderful brio of that sort of literary scene kind of vanished. And a lot of those men went on to write ghost stories, including the author of the Green Carnation, Robert Hitchens. And somebody else I wrote about in that thesis was Henry James himself, who wrote The Tragic Muse, which is about an artist who's trying to express something through his art that actually has something, I feel, to do with the relations between men. A summary like I use of what I was kind of talking about in that thesis is in A Whistle and I'll Come to You, My Lad by M.R. James, and so many other ghost stories. There just always seems to be something about this supernatural incursion that allows men to be in close quarters together at night and in private. So oftentimes this ghost seems to be something that, is both scary and full of potential for men. And in many cases, these authors, gay men. Yeah, a real scholar could have made something good of that idea, but my thesis is fairly half-assed. You can download it at McGill.
I don't know, that sounds pretty cool. That brings to mind, this is a bit of a digression, but I've recently been writing poetry about, have you ever heard of like the Moberly Jourdain incident before? It was like in 1910, these two kind of like blue stocking school mistresses who were rumored maybe to be lesbians. It's kind of, Terry Castle writes a lot about it, but they go to Versailles and they think they see these ghosts of Marie Antoinette and her like footmen. But historians have looked into it and they think that Baron de Montesquieu was doing like tableau vivant at the same time. What you're describing, I thought it was kind of interesting, this intermingling of these kind of repressed kind of skeptics with these kind of dandy decadents.
My cat's name is Moberly.
Oh, is that just a coincidence that your cat is named Moberly?
Yeah, it's named after a street name in Kelowna, but I think there's like some sort of English explorer whose last name was James Moberly, I believe. So there's a few street names in Canada named that. Yeah.
Cool. That's wow, how serendipitous. This is a tangential Oscar Wilde question. It doesn't have anything to do with your thesis. I'm a fan of Joyce Carol Oates, and I was, stuck on my novel the other day. I looked up writing tips, Joyce Carol Oates, found a series of 10 writing tips, and one included an epigram from Oscar Wilde, which I was a little bewildered by. It said, quote, "A little sincerity is a dangerous thing, and a great deal of it is absolutely fatal," unquote. So she just provides that as a writing tip, no explanation. So knowing that you wrote your master's thesis on Wilde, and I watched an interview with you in the Oakville News in which you advocated for taking oneself seriously as a writer. So I was curious if you could help me unpack that or how you feel about that.
I think that's Wilde, to put it crudely, saying nobody cares about your feelings and nobody gives a fuck what you think, which I think is an important part of writing, in that, of course, both of those things are essential to a vivid, good work of art, but without being shaped by things like narrative and style, they mean nothing. Like Wilde's style was absolutely paramount, and that's the reason why that epigram is so elegant, and what I said is just so coarse and stupid, is because he's actually applied style and craft to it, so it actually becomes something to think about and not a brutal admonishment.
I was just thinking about an interview you did with Samantha Fitzpatrick for the Malahat Review, where you talk about your experience as a novella prize winner and judge. And you said something interesting in that interview that I wanted to ask you about. Quote, "Contests do not dictate your worth as a writer or the viability of your career," which just struck me as a very good reminder for any writer to return to. I guess what you're talking about now, there are certain things that we ought to keep in mind when we're writing, such as I think, insightful point you just made about feelings and how that is not in itself enough to kind of engender an exciting work of fiction. All this to say, you've had a lot of professional and critical success, and I was curious how you maintain focus on your work without placing too much stock in external reception? Like, how do you find ways to cut through the noise? Is it an ongoing challenge? I know for me, social media can be a big challenge for things like that. There can be a lot of noise, and it's interesting to hear how other writers work around that, if that makes sense.
The only unmitigated pleasure and fulfillment I get is from the creation of the work itself. And for all those successes and plaudits, there are so many failures, including like extremely recent, huge failures in my career that are, those are much more overwhelming than any successes or any sort of sense of the greater literary culture and my place in it. So it actually became pretty easy from early on to just look at my work and what I'm doing. But yes, certainly when I did have more social media, I definitely just found it as an engine of distraction about things that did feel relevant at the time. But now I don't think I want to have emotions at my computer, really, unless I'm actually writing something or creating something. But in terms of using that as a way of interacting with either the political world or the artistic world, I just realized that there was actually nothing good about it for me. Nothing came of it, and it would, it just has such a massively destructive impact on your concentration when the same machine that you use to do your work is also the machine you use to distract yourself from it. So yeah, it's always a struggle. I don't have like monk-like discipline, but I always have this reminder of like, I actually like doing this. I like writing, whereas I don't like almost any of the rest of it. So
yeah, that makes sense. I mean, why else do we do it other than we like it? Mike and I talk about sometimes. Some writers say it's really painful and hard to write, but when I was reading interviews with you, I was struck. I mean, I find writing really enjoyable and fun. I don't find being on social media very fun at all, and I agree with you. I mean, I do so much stuff on my computer with like blockers and muting. Like, it's just absurd. I really like how you put it. The same machine that distracts you is what you need to use to write. Does that mean you compose on your computer? Some people use like longhand or even dictation, but are you a just straight up computer guy?
I use notebooks for notes, like especially if I'm, sort of building a book out of other books, like lots of research. And I'll sometimes use longhand for just passages from where I'm quite unsure still in the writing process, whether that's at the beginning or midway through. But for the most part, yeah, it's in just the same Microsoft Word 2014 program I've been using. Yeah.
Excellent. You mentioned process. I read an interview with you in Ampersand Review in which you mentioned that you prefer to write a first draft of a novel before getting to the outlining stage. And so I'm curious, what kind of information does this first draft elicit for you, and which part of the process do you enjoy more, the first draft or the outlining?
I must have been skimming a bit of my answer there, because I actually usually like to write about 100 pages of a first draft and then sort of back off and do some sort of planning, which is never actually still rigid planning. In screenwriting, which I often do in partnership with my frequent writing partner, Kris Bertin, in that world, we always have a very strict outline. And when I've written screenplays alone, also outlined from the beginning. I think I lost the second half of your question there because I was concentrating on answering the first half.
No worries. Yeah, it was kind of a long question. Maybe you already answered this, but I said, like, what kind of information does the first draft elicit for you that gets you to the outlining stage?
For one thing, it's often a viability test. Like, I've actually had a lot of novels fail at that point, just be like, there wasn't enough here for a full story, or I'm not interested in this anymore. But yeah, I'd say the crucial information oftentimes has to do with pace, like how long is this going to be? How much have I already over-explained or done too much with? And then often it'll have to do with which characters are going to be more important than I thought they would be. That's sort of subconscious groundwork that goes into the first draft. A lot of what's happening there that's essential is me drawing connections that I didn't think were there consciously. If I just went in with an outline, I would never have access to those, or at least that's how I think. And yeah, I do think that the experience of reading is different from watching, especially like a traditional 3-act film, in that you're, I think, more open to using your subconscious as you react to what you're reading, and especially in terms of reacting to story. Expectation is slightly different and more fluid. And so I think compositionally, I prefer to use my subconscious more in writing fiction.
I thought it was very interesting that you gestured to these experiences of failure, which often for public writers are very invisible. Like we don't really talk about failures or things that didn't pan out. And if you'll indulge a brief personal experience, I was really curious to get your perspective on something. I've been working on a novel that I started researching for back in 2018, and on and off, the book has just sort of like ended up on the sidelines. I've written other novels in the meantime. I've written lots of short stories, academic essays, and things like that. And I keep coming back to the novel. And after a period where it had been sitting there for close to a year, I looked at it again and I realized the final third needed to be entirely rewritten, which is maybe 20,000 words worth. And I read an interview, the interview Miriam was just quoting with Ampersand, where you said something very interesting. You said, quote, "I think that doubt helps me stay grounded about even the good things in my career. And that career is still riddled with failure, with more projects that don't get published or don't reach the screen or don't get optioned." So I was very curious to hear if you have ever abandoned a novel, and what was that decision like? If so, was it a hard choice to make?
Yeah, well, I've finished novels that I tried to get like a novel in particular that I tried to get published and I still think is quite good. But I realized that I'd either have to continue to just revise it and send it out again, or, accept sort of like a publication, a path to publication that I feel like would kind of be counterproductive for my career, as in it would make me look like my career was in decline. So for, almost cynical reasons, I thought, A, maybe this actually is not good enough. And B, even if it is good enough, and I'm right that it is, it might not actually help me to have it published. So that's an experience of sort of giving up that matters. But in terms of like projects that I've gotten really deep into and then given up on, yeah, like that has happened for sure, including like a pretty recent short novel as well that I might do something with. I feel like it has about 50% viable, interesting stuff in it, but it began to sort of look like, even to me, and I would, if I get this feeling, I feel like a readership certainly would, it looked like a slightly lesser version of something that I'd already done. And I wondered, will I be able to not only make this better, but also quite distinct? And I feel like the answers might be no. But also, I think there's like a real, and from the business and tech world, talking about failure is actually done a lot, but by successful people. Like they tell you that it's important to fail, et cetera, et cetera. And I think sometimes writers either don't talk about it at all or talk about it a little too much. And I see this happen in showbiz as well. And I think it's actually a bad mistake to get too specific about it in that particular world, because if people get the impression that you're a loser and or on the decline, it's actually actively bad for you, and that's not fair, of course, but it remains a fact.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, you brought up another relatable dilemma. Sometimes it's like, do I opt to publish this someplace that maybe isn't my dream home, or that is not following a certain trajectory or narrative I might have for my career, just to get it out there, which I think I'm often of the mind that I just want the work out there in some capacity. Or, there is also that element where it's important to think about your career as a whole and your vision for your career and things like that. So they're quandaries. Yeah. They're difficult questions to answer.
I feel more, now that I have books that exist, I feel like I can be a little more even-headed about whether something comes out or not. I often ask myself, is it better than nothing? Like, is this option for the work better than nothing? And if you're not sort of like leading by ego or a distorted perception of your worth or the quality of your work, oftentimes the answer is no, it's not better than nothing. Nothing is better. And you still have managed to do the work too. Like both these projects that I've alluded to, one of which is like, I don't think will ever come out, one of which I might not work on again. Writing them was still quite fulfilling. Like the exchange of time for potential income was disastrous, but in terms of like actual fulfillment, it was good. It was good to have written those things.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's one way to look at it that when you write things, you are improving your skills, but I'm a little earlier career than both of you. I've not published, I mean, I published short stories and like reviews and stuff. And like one thing that's been nice for me is not to be like cutesy about it, but you don't know me, Naben, but I'm a pretty like cheerful person when you meet me, but I like to write pretty dark stuff. And it's been really like exciting to see my body of work in the world and to think, oh yeah, like I guess it's all dark, like it's all kind of homogenous, or like there's a narrative there. But then when you talk about like you two are talking about like kind of if your career has launched, you have the trajectory, you can plateau, like once you kind of rise up, you can either stagnate, fall, or keep on rising. And I don't necessarily have a question, but it's interesting to me that you have a pen name. I guess that's one way to kind of explore different avenues for writing without avoiding kind of branding yourself or pigeonholing yourself. Is that kind of, I know that you have in interviews mentioned Craig Davidson, Nick Cutter, that was kind of like not your inspiration. All kinds of people do pen names, but if you could speak to just generally speaking this idea of like career and branding and finding a place with publishers, that would be great.
Yeah, that was certainly what I had in mind, is I wanted to write different kinds of work. And the case of Nathan Ripley, my pseudonym, that was for a psychological thriller. And then I wrote another one. And actually, increasingly in recent years, I find that the thriller audience, they really like what they like. But even so, at the time when I first published that in 2018, I knew, like, for example, like something like Helpmeet, or possibly Helpmeet, but like say my novella in Dead Writers, that was not for that audience. That audience would not like it. So if they bought a book thinking that it was the guy who'd written Find You in the Dark, I think that would be irritating for them. And often, like, I don't think just in terms of branding, but in terms of, just feeling bad for someone wasting their time and or money on my stuff when they wouldn't like it. So in a way, the pseudonym is sort of a warning label as much as it's an attraction. And in my case, I made it a transparent pseudonym, as I believe Nick Cutter, Craig does too. That Nathan Ripley is Naben Ruthnum, Craig Davidson is Nick Cutter. That's very clear on the back cover of the book. But yeah, I mean, it did seem necessary to sort of inform a potential audience of what they were potentially going to be reading. I do find, though, interestingly, that when I finished Helpmeet and was going to get it out with Undertow, and I've written a couple of like horror things since, including like a horror book for younger readers, I did them under my own name because I don't know, it just seemed to be, not that there isn't a tradition of writers like, say, Graham Greene writing thrillers, entertainments under their own name as well as literary fiction, but horror to me always seemed a little more porous with literary fiction, because there's almost not a grander, but at least in my reading life, more noticeable tradition of people like Henry James and Edith Wharton. You read The Turn of the Screw by Henry James, and you read The Americans by Henry James, and stylistically, you're in the exact same worlds. So the style sort of ruled that. Like, I feel like someone who likes Helpmeet would possibly like my literary fiction if they enjoyed the subject matter of it. Whereas I don't really see the same for most thriller readers. Not all, but most.
Well, that brings up a question that I had in mind as you were just talking about Helpmeet especially, and I can see those influences in the novella. I think it draws on a variety of horror traditions, though. Part of what makes it so interesting is that the setting and the atmosphere recall certain works of 19th century Gothic literature, especially American Gothic literature, but it also engages with body horror conventions. As you pointed out, The Fly has been an influence, and it even slips into capital W weird territory at the end. So I was curious, how conscious are you of genre when you write? Is it something that kind of mobilizes you as a writer, or is it more kind of automatic than that? Is it more instinctive?
I think it's pretty automatic. It's pretty idea and character led, all of my writing. But I think Helpmeet is a case where, like, it's certainly the best received thing I've ever written. So in that sense, I'll talk about it as though it is good. And I believe that it is good because, it concentrated, whatever, at that point, 40 years or, 35 years since I'd started reading very different kinds of supernatural fiction and watching supernatural stuff on screen. And I feel that yes, I had the characters, yes, I had the idea, but that sort of compression of different kinds of horror came about quite naturally by the person who was writing it being really steeped in all those traditions. And then the fact that it's so short kind of makes it seem, it tricks you into thinking it's more interesting than it is, I think, because all of these things are colliding in a very short space, in a very short span. But of course, like, all those traditions are so interrelated. Like, if Lovecraft's essay, Supernatural Horror and Fiction, really covers all of that territory. He talks about writers in all of those little subgenres that you mentioned. So in a sense, also, it's just that, you know, it's the story of style and individuality is really the story of literature, I think. And that sort of collision of a lot of genres in a particular work happened because of that individual's style more often than not, if the work is successful. I think it's oftentimes you can see this sort of the seams rather in the stitches when someone's really trying to Frankenstein genres together to create an exciting effect, when it's not really something that's naturally felt by them and by the story.
That's very well put. I think a lot of writing is about voice and individuality, in the sense that only that person can write that. Not about like ego, I guess, but just about like the subconscious, as you brought up earlier. And I find what you say about genre interesting, and the fact that you kind of have distinguished that, especially more recently. I don't know, I could be wrong, but you did allude to this in the Ampersand review, this idea that, like, maybe in the 70s, 80s, 90s, I personally felt as though, like, thrillers, like, had a lot more what I often call atmosphere. I guess you could call it style too. And for the record, I really loved Find You in the Dark. I thought it had a lot of, having read Your Peace and Dead Writers first, I thought it had, like, it was working in the tradition of genre, but it did have your voice in it and some really beautifully crafted metaphors and sentences. But I digress. I guess I like things that are kind of like towing the line between literary and thriller, hopefully not because I'm pretentious, just because I like that atmosphere, I like that voice, that style. And so you had mentioned in Ampersand Review, you had thrown out the year 1978 as like a big year, but maybe that was somewhat arbitrary. I'd just be curious to hear more about what thrillers you're talking about, like, because you kind of alluded to reading kind of more literary thrillers that were published late-ish 20th century.
Definitely Patricia Highsmith and Ruth Rendell come to mind. But, you know, I've been thinking more about this, though. Like, there's a lot of really, like, blunt instrument American noir, like David Goodis and Jim Thompson, that's still, like, it's very much like, you know, spinner rack fiction, where, like, the plot is very straightforward. This happens, this happens, this happens. But they are still very internal novels of character. Those are obviously, like, from an earlier time, the 50s. But if you look at a Ruth Rendell novel or a Barbara Vine novel, her pseudonym, it's impossible to imagine it being published as a mainstream thriller now. It really is. I mean, I know there is still a lot of sophisticated thriller writing, and I also know that I'm not intensely aware of the thriller market in 2025, but much of modern thriller stuff is more like the sort of Sherry LaPena sort of what if this happened to me page turner, where almost characters sort of the enemy of the plot, because it's meant to be sort of an exercise for the reader to sort of envision this happening to them. So it's plot. And those for me are just not that, I'm not interested in that. So that's sort of what I mean when saying more literary, which I say all the time, is almost wrong. It's because a lot of these thriller writers would be surprised that I'm applying this term to them. Like Cecil Day-Lewis is Daniel Day-Lewis's dad, who wrote as Nicholas Blake too. He was a very serious poet, and then his thrillers, I don't think he would really have described them as being particularly literary. You know, he was just trying to write things that were entertaining and would sell. But in order to do that, he was writing interesting, sophisticated novels of character as well. It just kind of, the expectations of the market have changed and veered so much towards propulsion and turning those pages. Suddenly the things that I really like look more like something that FSG would publish in 2025 than something that you would find on a spinner rack in Shoppers.
Absolutely. No, that's very well put. And I love Ruth Rendell is like one of my go-tos. Also, Claude Chabrol, I guess, did a lot of her films, and I love his adaptations of her too.
Awesome. Yeah. He's great.
Do you have any recommendations? I want to read more Ruth Rendell, but she's got such a big oeuvre. I've only read A Fatal Inversion. Oh, I guess the Barbara Vine, A Fatal Inversion, A Dark Adapted Eye, and then, I don't know. Every time I go to Valley Village, there's all this Ruth Rendell, and I'm like, where do I put my time?
For one thing, you can't go that wrong. Like I've read a couple that were maybe like a 7 out of 10, but, I'm just looking at mine now. Master of the Moor, which is a Rendell, and The House of Stairs by Barbara Vine are, I think, both, 10 out of 10. Excellent thrillers.
Amazing. Thank you. I'm excited. Those both are just very enticing titles, so I'll keep my eye out for those at the local thrift store. We live in a smaller city, someone is dumping all kinds of Ruth Rendell all over every time I go anywhere. So I'll keep my eye out for that. I will admit I'm not super well versed in thrillers of 2025, so I don't want to speak too broadly of what's out there. But I did just pick up a thriller. I was excited to read it. And I really like It's The Secret History by Donna Tartt. That book just really wowed me in terms of like a great thriller. And there was, in one blurb, kind of made mention of it. And when I started reading it, I just got this feeling like that AI could have written it. Like it was just, it's hard to explain, but it just, to me, like thriller without kind of atmosphere and creepiness and dread is just, it's not something I want to do. And I think character, I wasn't really thinking about character much going in, but as I'm talking to you, I mean, character is obviously a huge part of thriller. So my question, much like Mike, I will ask a question to you. Maybe you can help me with something I'm working on. I'm presently writing my first novel, which is kind of like a mystery thriller. And so far, the biggest challenge, which was unexpected for me, was juggling a broadcast of potential suspects. I guess like just a broadcast of characters, but when you're writing in a mystery thriller, you kind of need to make them all kind of fit certain, red herrings, wrong footing, all that kind of thing. So it just seems to be a necessary ingredient for the genre. And I was really impressed with how you pulled off this feat in Find You in the Dark. You do have at least 5 or 6, if not more, I think definitely more than that, characters that are really fleshed out. They have their own motivations, their own wants and needs and goals. And I'm wondering if you have any best practices or lessons learned for character generation in this respect.
Well, I'll lead with the truth and then follow up with some not quite lies, but truthfully, that really does just come out in the first draft for me. I'm writing, and if a character seems half-baked, then I'll probably just keep on writing for a bit. But then if the character is going to remain in the book, I have to also be able to envision them in their own short story, being able to, go home, have coffee, think about things. That person has to be a person, or else they're just there as a function of plot. And when you're writing like a really propulsive page-turning thriller, I don't think that's necessarily the most crucial consideration. But when you're writing this other kind, I think it is really important. And I think it enriches any sort of writing. And yeah, I think it can often just be a couple of touches on the page, but I think it's actually quite important for the writer to be able to envision a whole life for all of these characters. But yeah, truthfully, for me, it happens. The flaw will appear first, and then the fix will appear later. And often, like, I think most of the sort of bad writing you were talking about is very TV brained. There's good television, of course, great television. But I think when prose writers exclusively marinate in television, they forget that sort of cop who walks on and is like, I've been in this business a long time. This is the worst thing I've ever seen. Also, we get to see that policeman. We get to see the actor's portrayal of them. There's so much stuff that makes that character in that like 40 seconds on CSI NY a character. And that's because you're actually looking at a person doing that character. But sometimes they'll try to translate that into a book, and that creates really shallow characters.
Oh, definitely agreed. TV has its merits when it comes to using it to inform writing, but obviously if you're a writer, you have to read a lot. That's lesson number 1. But just to get kind of more into the weeds of what you're saying, because this is helpful to me, thank you. So when I'm writing my manuscript, I often stop. I'm like, wait, I'm encountering this new character. I don't know anything about them. In order to even know what their mannerisms are, I have to understand what their flaw is or what kind of shard of glass, so to speak, is stuck in them that makes them the way they are. Like, do you do any kind of character mapping, character case files, or do they just come out as you're writing, like exploratory writing?
I think that would be pretty fatal to me. I think that would really strangle something important in how I make characters. It is something I'd look at after a draft, but no, I feel like, something inside of me, my subconscious essentially, if it introduces that character, will know something more about that character. If anything, my strategy is if that happens, I have to continue writing for, a few pages, like 3 or 4 pages before shutting down for the day, because that will reveal something that is often like quite connected to the plot. If there's somebody staying in a hotel who looks a certain way that my character sees, I'll realize, like going back 10 pages or 15 pages, that of course somebody needed to be at that destination in order to make that character's trip make sense. Somebody has to be waiting for them in expectation, but that was never my intention. But since I didn't know that when I was writing, I also don't know what the expectation and what the intention of that character who's waiting is, and I have to sort of write my way towards it. And I feel that by sort of Dungeons and Dragoning that character and making them a character first before putting them into the story, I will have strangled a path for me. Then again, I'm always suspicious of this kind of like ultra mystical writing talk that I'm doing right now, because my screenplays, especially my screenplays with Kris, are good. And we do all of that beforehand. We certainly don't write character sketches for everybody, but since we've outlined every single scene in the movie, we know how all these people behave. So the nuance and all these things appear in dialogue choices when we're actually writing. So I do want to say that this is how I do it. But obviously there's a way to write extremely plotted fiction that is also very character rich. Outlined fiction, not plotted fiction.
That makes perfect sense. I mean, in my case too, I'm doing a master's in creative writing, so my thesis is my novel. So God bless my wonderful supervisor, but sometimes for the kind of socio-political things I'm interested in, he's like, no, it should be more like make these people more Christian or something like that. Because I read about weird new age feminists. But yeah, so I guess it's that it's one thing to collaborate with someone where I would imagine when you're collaborating with your collaborator, Kris Bertin, that you would both need to have a sense of who a character is to share that, so that you're kind of going in the same direction. But I think there is something mystical and subconscious. Yeah, we don't need to romanticize it, but when you're writing on your own, you don't need to do that. And I would prefer not to do that. Talking this out is actually helpful. I love my supervisor, but
a very useful thing from showbiz, where when you get network notes or notes from a producer, those can vary wildly in quality. I've had amazing producer notes, maybe not so much network notes, but I haven't done that many times. But yeah, it was my friend who's a very established television writer with a novel coming out soon, Patrick Tarr. He said, every creative writing student might know this already, but he said you should always look for the note behind the note. Sometimes, for example, what you just said about the these characters should be more Christian. That to me, I would take that as I'm probably not rendering how interesting their weird set of beliefs is effectively enough. It's actually not coming out, because he would never make that comment if he actually got it. And then potentially there's a fact that he just will never get it, no matter how good a job you do. He or she, sorry, I don't know who your supervisor is. But yeah, I've always found that very useful. I just take it as something isn't quite working, and that person has sort of put a spotlight on the area that isn't quite fleshed out enough. So how do I make it good enough that question vanishes for them?
Wow, yeah, no, that's actually genuinely really, really helpful. That's a good point. But I guess that's just part of being a professional writer. Like you say, you get network notes. There's no perfect scenario in which you get to write alone without input from people who have a financial stake in your writing. So I guess just getting used to it is probably the best course.
I'm excited to ask Fawn who your supervisor is after we have this conversation.
Yeah, that's Fawn mentioned that she was a friend of yours too. So we love Fawn.
You brought up your screenwriting partner, Kris Bertin, a few times. And this is another question about Helpmeet. I read a 2022 interview you did with CBC where you mentioned that you and Bertin originally conceived of that novella as a film, and you said it was in a very different form. So I was curious how your literary vision for that novella differed from the cinematic vision, and if you would be able to describe how the film version would have looked in some sense.
Well, we didn't co-create the idea, but we had we put together often like a sheet of 6 different potential ideas to pitch to people. And I think Help Me came from one that was about a woman taking her increasingly sick husband to a place in the countryside just to like attend to him dying, and that within him something had been planted and was growing, and somebody was coming there to collect it. So it's actually not that different, but in terms of how I thought about it as a film at the time, it would have been much more from sort of the end of the first act. The witch is there, like the enemy is there, because you couldn't really have sort of a traditional horror film, I feel, with the threat so absent. But, you know, strangely enough, Kris and I did end up getting hired to write the screenplay for Helpmeet. And it is much closer to the novel than I would have expected, because the production company and the director are really interested in the aspect of just tending to the sick husband, and the idea that the villain, the antagonist, is illness itself, in that illness and death for the beginning. And then, yes, of course, some more conventional horror touches, hopefully done creatively, also leap up early. But I think also it just became much more personal as a prose project, not necessarily like related to my life or anything, but in terms of, you know, when I conceive of an idea that Kris and I might write together, I'm detached from it in a way that I never am from my prose work. Because especially in those early ideas, if you're working in those early moments of an idea, if you're working with a partner, you cannot be just dead set on like, well, this happens, no, this happens. And it was my idea, so of course this has to happen. That would have killed our ability to collaborate, and certainly made every idea that I've brought to the partnership vastly inferior to what it ends up being, because I get to work with an extremely creative and, you know, unconventional writer.
I like asking writers about mentors or champions, like people who encouraged you at the right time or at the right age, people who were really pivotal in that way. Do you have any mentors or champions who really made a mark on you and who kind of motivated you at key moments in your writing life?
I think I've always been resistant to that sort of relationship. But I remember in grade 12 year, my English teacher, Shirley Stewart, just said, like, quite matter of factly, that I was going to be some sort of writer, as though she didn't have any stake in it. And that felt good to me, even though that was not at all my intention at the time, necessarily, to be a professional writer. But yeah, I just mentioned my friend Patrick Tarr, and he's someone I've learned so much from about the business, and also just about the simple mechanics of writing a television screenplay. I think a lot of people would describe that as a sort of mentor-mentee relationship, but that would gross both of us out, I think, because we're just friends, you know. Like, I've taken care of his dog, we hang out, we sometimes hang out and don't talk about writing. Like it's but, you know, in terms of someone more established who's taught me things, that's certainly been it. My friend Chris Ferguson, who's a producer, he has a company called Oddfellows Entertainment. They produced Longlegs actually recently, but he was someone who, like, I just known as, like, as a fellow party bar person in my early 20s in Vancouver, who, you know, always took my writing seriously. And like when Kris and I wrote our first, like, very sprawling, all over the place horror script, he was so enthused about it and started giving us, like, really steady actual work. So that, I think, probably means more to me than having him mentor me. That you know, he did have that belief in us professionally, as that, you know, these are people I'd want to work with.
Somewhat related to what you're talking about, you've just obviously brought up film a lot. You're both a screenwriter and a novelist. When I was reading Find You in the Dark, and I followed you on Letterboxd, so I have a sense of your interest, I saw that you're a fan of De Palma. I believe that Body Double is listed as one of your favorites, if that's correct. I don't know. Something that I'm interested in, I see this a lot actually in film. I find film often is borrowing from like video game grammar now. And then like, I guess why I brought up Find You in the Dark, I did find some like De Palma element, like there's a lot of voyeurism and there's a lot of kind of like grammatical, almost like not shaming, but like questioning why we're interested in true crime, why we're so curious about it. And that to me kind of reminded me of what De Palma does with voyeurism all the time. When you write like fiction, like not for the screen, but for the page, do you, not like in a TV brain way, like you brought up earlier, but are there any like positive elements of filmmaking, either like POV or like editing, that you would bring in or try to emulate on the page?
I think probably the one that comes to mind first is the idea of a really fixed structure, a fixed 3-act structure, because even some like strange movies that we would describe as like arty movies have like a really rigid 3-act structure, and that's because that's the way a lot of stories move, as all those screenwriting guides will tell you. And I think that I do have a sort of comparison index within me when I'm writing a piece of even like quite, for lack of a better word, self-indulgent literary fiction of, is this boring? Like, and Kafka doesn't write in a 3-act structure, but he's never boring, right? I look for something that's exciting and thrilling and has momentum, even if it's not that sort of page-turning thriller momentum in everything I write. And I do think that film is part of that sort of engine within me that sort of polices how self-indulgent I will be in a literary project. It's great, though, to bring up De Palma as sort of a marker for Find You in the Dark, because there are sort of like, obsessive sort of sweeping Steadicam type visual scenes in that book. I'd point also to I think James Ellroy, who wrote the novel that LA Confidential, that the movie was based on. He has a great, maybe the best, like sick serial killer book ever called Killer on the Road. And that has those elements in it too. James Ellroy hates Brian De Palma personally because he made a shitty version of the Black Dahlia. But also I think Ellroy is just not at all influenced by certainly modern cinema, maybe 50s cinema. But I feel like it's sometimes writing like his gets called cinematic, but actually it's just so immersive and visual because his commitment to the moment, to what is happening in every scene, is so well done. And I think our closest point of comparison, especially if we've been reading a certain kind of like dry late 20th century, early 21st century kind of prose writing, it seems cinematic. It's like, oh, that's from the movies. But no, it's also from literature, I think.
Totally. I wasn't going to bring this up, but since you brought up James Ellroy, I just read My Dark Places. And I mean, I think even if you haven't read this, one would know about his indiscretions. And I was curious, when I was reading Find You in the Dark, just the similarities between Martin's rap sheet, even the names of the girls whose houses he was breaking into. It felt very similar to James Ellroy. I don't know if that was...
You are correct. That's actually
Okay.
where that came from. Because Ellroy's an example, like, not that he talks about it in like contrite terms of like, geez, I was such a bad guy and I'm so reformed. He like really glories in his sordid past, even though he has a very, classic in a different frame trauma story. Like he found in Los Angeles police archives a picture of him reacting to being told of his mother's murder at 10 years old or whatever. But yeah, he's someone who did start on the road to being like a sick pervert serial killer, and then instead became a golf caddy and then a writer. I found that so interesting because he has all the he checks all the boxes. And if you read Killer on the Road, you'll see like, geez, that could have been you, James. So, but yes, you're right. That's like one of the real life touchstones for that book was the fact that you can be that way and sort of pull out of it. And it makes you worry, like, geez, how many women's romantic partners, husbands started on this path and then veered off it, or maybe only kind of veered off it, and they don't know anything about it. Creepy.
Yeah, I mean, it's like that element of true crime that I'm really interested in is like if you can kind of relate to or put your feet in the shoes of someone who did something terrible. It's, to me at least, interesting, kind of not humbling, but it's just like it makes for good writing, I guess, to think like these people they're not monster. I mean, you could call them monsters. A lot of them are, but they're just like you, and they're human beings too. And there's
Well, and certainly, like, it's very important to have a sense of judgment and moral disapproval and morals full stop as a person. But as a writer, I feel they can actually be very destructive. And I think that's actually a horrific problem in literature, and perhaps specifically Canadian literature in the past several years, is this sense that, like, even if you're writing about weird and unpleasant things, you have to make it so clear that you, the writer, don't think the bad things in the book. And often that's done so clumsily by having, like, the bad characters question themselves, and you clearly can see the writer appearing on the page being like, yeah, I'd never do something like this. I'm just saying I'm a really good person. And I actually just delivered all that as though that's what you have to do to get published. Absolutely not. Like, I just think it's a very common error that's turning up in a lot of modern stuff I read, and it stinks. I've seen it, really be destructive to some quite good books.
Agreed. Yeah, that kind of editorializing or distancing oneself from. I guess I think of it as another way in which it undermines the reader's intelligence. That you don't have to go around saying that I think Ted Bundy was a bad person. Like it's kind of it's the default opinion, I guess. So yeah.
I had a question about the novella form, Naben, because you, of course, wrote the novella in Dead Writers. We've talked a lot about Helpmeet. And I was just curious what you like specifically about the novella as a literary form. What is exciting about it to you as a writer? What can it do, in your opinion, that maybe other forms can't do?
Well, for one thing, I've sort of lost my ability to write quite short. Like, I can't really write a short story under 5,000 words anymore. Not that I try to do so much. But to speak specifically to, like, the reason why it's actually good and not just how I end up there, I find it just sort of the ideal length for a sustained narrative that has a lot of complexities that are sort of left out of being resolved in the story itself, but you just have more time than with a short story to sort of explore and push them a little bit. And I know, like, in that Dead Writers novella, which is honestly really more like a long story, it's definitely in between the two worlds, there is still a bunch of irresolution at the end of it in terms of, like, what the literal place they arrive at actually means. You've been able to see enough of everybody's intention and motivation, and at least for a writer of my skills, like, I don't have the absolute Chekhovian compression skills. I feel like it gives you enough to really see how multifaceted all the motivations and intentions are coming to this sort of irresolute ending. With Helpmeet, I think it's just more to sort of conceive of a piece of horror like that as a novel. I just cannot imagine it having become quite diluted. It's such a single arc. Like, basically, it's a road trip and a destination, and then something happens at that destination. Inevitably, like, to make that into a novel, there would have been a lot more about the past of the two protagonists and probably more about the antagonist. And when I think of adding that to this idea, it just inevitably it makes it weaker. So I think that I cannot remember, some notable writer has said that, maybe Robert Aikman, that the short form is really where horror exists and excels and does best. And I think whoever that was talking about the short story, but for me, it's also encompasses the novella. Like, the Beckoning Fair one by Oliver Onions is another great example of something that's just like it's just such a strange tissue of ideas, and if it was added to or explained anymore, it would completely dissolve and not be effective.
Yeah, it's an interesting point. It's especially interesting to think about it within the context of horror fiction, what the novella brings to that genre and what it allows that genre to do that maybe a larger or smaller form might not. I'm editing a collection on Peter Straub right now, and I'm going back through a lot of his work, and I'm kind of amazed at how good his novellas are. And I like his work in general, but I find sometimes his novels become kind of digressive, and which I can enjoy, but there's something about the novella form that kind of distills and concentrates all the things that are great about his writing. And you brought up Henry James as well, and Herman Melville. I guess in the American Gothic tradition, so many of the great works are novellas, which strikes me as interesting.
That's right. If Straub's a great example, you can imagine an entirely different career with him, that where he did write in the short form more. Because I enjoy his digressions and his sprawl, and like in books like, even something fairly brief like in The Night Room, there's a lot of extra there. And like The Throat is, in a way too long, but you kind of get a lot out of that extra sort of fluffiness around the story. But I think, his short work is pretty unassailably like great horror fiction. And I think I think he would have a different reputation, but much less money if he had written in the short form. But then again, like, so much of that money came from Ghost Story, which I think is his third or fourth book in. He could have potentially just written short stories the rest of his life. But I appreciate and love his novels too. So I don't.
Me too.
Yes. Yeah.
No disrespect to Straub's novels. They're great. But there's something about him in the short form that's uniquely exciting. But yes, I do love his novels too. In the Night Room's an underrated one. You never hear people talk about that.
Yeah, it was a sort of an accidental pickup for me. I think, again, actually at a library sale. I think what certainly makes me and possibly other people hesitate about his books is so many of them seem so interrelated, because he uses that Timothy Underhill character. I think that's the name.
Yes.
But they're not really that related, except for like Coco and The Throat are pretty crucial to have read one to understand the other.
I could geek out about Straub for a while, Miriam, but I'll let you put us back.
I was just trying to remember. Mike and I are partners, so was In the Night Room the one you were reading in bed, and it had all those weird, like really bizarre
emails? Yeah.
Yeah, with like, okay, they're
strange. Okay. It's a weird book.
I've only read Ghost Story, so. Well, anything else on Straub before
I'll just say you should read If You See Me Now. It's about struggling to finish a thesis.
Yeah.
It's great.
Oh, yes. Oh, yeah. Okay. That's the one that, Mike recommended to me too. It's someone in a house going a little crazy trying to write their thesis, like in a farmhouse or something. Yeah, that'll be me. I'm living that now. So maybe if I read it, I'll find out how to get myself out of this situation. Here's one of our more generic questions for you, Naben. Which element of writing do you struggle with the most? Is there something that you really don't like doing? Could be dialogue, character, plot, description, editing.
I would say of all those things, it's probably plot. That's the thing where I wish I could be a bit more formulaic, like in terms of my approach, like as I am with screenwriting. It's the thing that I never know quite when to do. I just know when not to do it. Whereas everything else I feel pretty confident about. The only natural talent I ever had as a writer is dialogue. Like, not that I write the best dialogue, but I rarely write first draft terrible shit dialogue. Like, that often comes out okay, and then I can make it better. So that's the easiest part for me, I think.
If dialogue comes easily to you, because I struggle with dialogue a little bit, I would imagine, and we talked about this earlier, but character, because to me, character is and dialogue are like inextricable from one another. It sounds as though you have like a strong sense of character in your head. Do you find that helps you with the dialogue?
Yeah, I think that's astute and not something I would have thought of myself, but maybe that's why I feel a little less like I have to do a lot of thinking ahead with the character. Like, maybe because I'm writing their dialogue in a first draft way that I find comfortable, I might already think like, okay, so I must know this character if I know how they talk.
I'm curious to hear from writers if you ever received a piece of writing advice that really stuck with you, and it could be for better or for worse. I think sometimes you get a piece of writing advice that you think that was actually like counterproductive, you know?
Yeah. This writer named Corey Keegan, who's from BC, actually just really generously read an early piece of mine and said that I can tell this means a lot to you, but it doesn't mean a lot to me. And then he like singled out one line and was like, there's detail in this and I really like this, like this is good writing. But the rest of it, all I can kind of get from it is a sense that it matters to the writer, that there's a lot of emotion there, but that's not enough. Like you're not there yet. So that's actually quite similar to what we were saying about the Oscar Wilde epigram earlier. And that was important to me because it's sort of, being the age I am, I thought that serious writing was the stuff that it was very related to like beat writing and things like that. Like I thought that it had to come from this sort of upswell and flow of emotion and like just immediacy, and that's where the truth comes from. It's totally incorrect. And I think part of that terrible influence that the beats had is from Jack Kerouac being like an excellent first draft writer. But, all that stuff could have been a lot better. And of course, he's a poor example too, in that I think a lot of that stuff was revised. But that sort of notion that your most honest work is going to be your quickest work, your most like the purest like line from the mind to the pen to the page, it's false. Like that's not how you write well. It takes like a sort of Nabokovian concentration and distillation to make good writing, no matter what kind of writing you do.
Yeah, that's really well put. That reminds me, one of the biggest revelations I had as a writer, I took a course through U of T School of Continuing Studies, and we were shown like first drafts of DeLillo, and I realized, it doesn't come out of you fully formed. Yeah. So it was really reassuring. It was like, I was like, that kind of looks like the kind of stuff I spit out. It's not, I mean, mine could never come close to DeLillo, but Have you read anything recently that's particularly spoken to you, excited you, pissed you off?
The novel Flicker by Theodore Roszak, which I'd never heard about before. It's actually become like an increasingly popular genre now, the sort of hunt for a lost filmmaker book. But this one is like, it's like a very highbrow thriller, like The Name of the Rose, but also just about the horror of obsession and like the beauty of film. And it's so convoluted and weird and conspiracy steeped that it should be totally absurd. But it's just really well written and full of passion, and and the trap ends up feeling like a trap that I could fall into. That was great. And, I think it's a pretty forgotten early 90s book that's been optioned multiple times, but nobody could figure out how to make it. I highly recommend that.
You're right. Cool. There is this like recent kind of surge of dark and horror fiction writing about film. Tons of people are kind of jumping on that. I mean, it's been around for a while, but there does seem to be like a swell of it right now, which is interesting.
I think, the new Gretchen Felker Martin is like that, and Michael Wehunt, who's an American writer I really like, has one like that that's really good, actually. I've read that in ARC. Yeah, it's a good conversation. I appreciate it.
Thank you. We really appreciate it. It's been a lot of fun. So
yeah, thanks for coming on.
Oh, and thanks for the review, Miriam. It's always hard to get any attention to those bizarre books.
It was my pleasure. It was really enjoyable to read, and Norm is so nice and helpful. Yeah. So yeah. Well, take care. Best of luck with all your writing endeavors and screen endeavors.
You guys too.